So, dear colleagues, let me then move to our second panel, which is devoted to international trade and COVID, very timely topic. And I hope that our chair is here, Professor Alan Winters, who is Professor of Economics and Director of United Kingdom Trade Policy Observatory in University of Sussex. So, Professor Alan, please let us know if you are here. And yes, thank you very much. Thank you very much. So, floor and everything is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Daria and Rita. And how very nice to see 78 people signed on. So thank you very much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. So this is international trade and COVID-19. International trade system was a bit sickly before we started with COVID, but the COVID pandemic has created a shock that has got pretty close to shaking the system to breaking point. It's legitimized the views that are around in plenty of places that we should be pulling our horns in, relying less on international relations, international contacts, and more on domestic supplies and so on. At least to nearly everybody in my profession as an economist, that is not a very sensible prescription. And not only are we in danger, in a sense, of moving away from the relatively liberal regime we've developed over the last 30 or 40 years, but we are in danger at the same time of undermining the institutions that have supported it and allowed it to if not flourish, at least survive. So in fact, the stakes are very high at the moment. We've got 6 papers for this afternoon's session, excellent papers all the way through. And since they are, the authors are the people who were advertised, you don't want to hear me speaking, you want to hear them speaking. So I am not going to say anything more about it. We will get on and have the real people speaking. So the first of the speakers is Dr. Jan Haynes, who is a senior counsel at the ACWL in Geneva, and who wishes, he'll probably say it himself, but make the disclaimer that he's speaking in an entirely personal capacity. When I worked for the World Bank, I used to say, I'm speaking in a personal capacity. The World Bank probably doesn't know what I'm saying, and if they did, they'd probably hate it. Jan might feel the same. Jan's also a visiting lecturer at the Graduate Institute. Everyone has agreed to speak for just 8 minutes. It's going to be a race, but I am charged with keeping tabs on you all. So I'm going to turn my camera off, but I will turn it on once we get towards the end of the 8 minutes. So Jan, well, you can tell us yourself, but it's an overview of trade-related measures taken by WTO members during the COVID-19 pandemic. So Jan, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan, for the kind introduction. I'll try to share my screen, and I hope that it will be visible. So I trust that my screen is visible and that you can all hear me. I see.
Yes, we can.
Professor Volkan nodding. Great. Thank you very much, Alan. Professor Winters, for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers for involving me in this wonderful event. It's great to see many old friends only online, but it's still great to see all of you. I will skip the part about personal capacity then, since Alan already, Professor Winters already mentioned that. What I'd like to do today, or what my paper is about, is basically an inventory of the types of measures that governments have taken with respect to in response to the COVID-19 crisis and with respect to which products, as well as what the WTO rules are that are applicable to those measures, and to provide a few reflections on those. Now, given the time restrictions, I will limit myself just to the first point and basically set out an inventory of those measures that have been taken now in the immediate crisis and that might be taken going forward, So we can broadly group those measures into measures that restrict trade. And here, most prominently, governments have taken temporary in many instances, but still export restrictions. And I'll probably say most about these export restrictions. There have been some import restrictions as well, and there may be more to come. There are measures that facilitate trade. Governments have been very conscious of requiring a number of products to deal with the pandemic, medical products, food products. So there's been quite a bit of trade facilitation going on the import side. And then there are also subsidies, massive stimulus packages that will have a great impact on trade, presumably going forward. Now, I had prepared this long presentation with lots of pictures, and then I found out that I only was given 8 minutes, so I will deprive you of the ability to see many of those pictures, but I do want to show you a couple of them. So for the export restrictions, if we get started, is on the export restriction side, Professor van den Bosche earlier mentioned that a number of governments, he mentioned the statistics from the WTO, that by April 2020, out of the 164 WTO members, 80 countries had introduced export prohibitions or restrictions of some kind, primarily on medical and food products. So if you look at the type of products that have been restricted by these export restrictions, it's really the medical products, so personal protective equipment, gowns, masks, laboratory equipment, ventilators, lots of medical machinery, pharmaceuticals, the input products for producing pharmaceuticals. Obviously, all of this with the main intent to safeguard sufficient domestic supply. But of course, at the same time, depriving your trading partners from having access to these badly needed products. Now, some of the other products that have been affected by these export restrictions have been food products, commodities such as wheat and rice, as well as processed food products. Although there's been some criticism here that, in fact, unlike in 2008, 2009, these measures were not needed because there was no shortage of food or food commodities and no increase in prices. But governments learned a lot of lessons, presumably in 2008, 2009, and were concerned about potential shortages. So food was sort of wrapped up in these restrictions. And finally, there have been some additional products thrown in for good measure. Professor van den Bosche mentioned these export restrictions on toilet paper, and he said he couldn't really understand why members would restrict exports on that product. But let me just say that nothing compares to the ray of sunshine in the otherwise drab and sad life of a trade lawyer than discussing with your colleagues export restrictions on toilet paper and wondering how a WTO panel would assess the WTO consistency of export restrictions on toilet paper, in particular whether there are less trade restrictive alternatives to limiting exports of toilet paper. But jokes aside, these export restrictions have of course been imposed to, like I said, to ensure sufficient supply and availability on the domestic market of these badly needed urgently needed products such as medical products, in particular to prevent hoarding and price gouging. Interestingly, the Chinese government introduced an export licensing requirement to respond to concerns about quality of certain Chinese products that have been rejected in the European Union in particular. And so they introduced certain licensing requirements. The products had to correspond both to the export country's technical standards as well as to the Chinese standards. So that was sort of a interesting export restriction as well. The form of these measures, quite interesting, in some instances an outright export ban or export quotas, export licensing. There have been prohibitions on parallel exports, so sort of resales, if you wish, by say retailers, wholesalers rather, re-exporting their purchases. And some governments put pressure on producers to, for instance, sell a certain percentage of their production on the domestic market before exporting. There probably have been plenty of informal measures where governments, exercise pressure behind the scenes on companies, asking them not to export or to limit exports. We also got some outright government requisitioning of stockpiles that affected both domestic and export market sales. Now, governments have obviously a lot of policy space to take these measures, especially in a time of crisis. So in terms of their WTO consistency, these measures, there are plenty of WTO provisions that would allow, broadly speaking, export restrictions of this kind on essential products and badly needed products. So there's plenty of policy space here, but there's a very lively debate to which Professor Winters alluded among economists and policymakers that these export restrictions are very, very suboptimal policy, and that these individual export restrictions at the national level add up to a very, very bad collective situation where governments don't trust each other, might introduce later on import restrictions to foster domestic industry. So there's a big, big policy debate going on here, which unfortunately I won't have the chance to get into. There have been plenty of interesting contributions from scholarly writing. Professor Winters himself has co-authored a paper with Simon Evenet proposing on how members could go ahead and conclude political deals to pledge to each other that they won't use that policy space that they have with respect to export restrictions to avoid the negative effects of these export restrictions. What about the import restriction side, very briefly? Mostly on the import side, we have seen import facilitating measures. But with respect to import restrictions, there have been a few in the early stages of the pandemic. Governments restricted or prohibited, say, imports of certain products like live animals or animal products for fear that these products could be vectors for the spread of COVID. Some governments started reacting to the generally worsened economic environment due to the COVID crisis. So few developing countries, for instance, Sri Lanka, introduced measures for balance of payments reasons to safeguard exchange rate. Other members introduced measures to shore up government revenues. Lots of governments were losing revenue. Developing countries often depend on revenue from import tariffs, and so as trade collapsed, governments imposed additional duties on products with an inelastic demand, like say fuel, tariffs or duties to shore up their government budgets. Going forward, of course, the big question is how will members react to the onsetting economic crisis? How will they, will they resort to protectionism to protect their industries more broadly? How will they react to the many subsidies that have been introduced by many, many governments? Professor van den Bossche mentioned economic nationalism, repatriation of supply chains. Governments can do a lot of things, including in a very WTO consistent way through increasing tariffs, trade remedies. So it remains to be seen what the situation will be. What lessons have we learned in the 2008-2009 crisis, where the mainstream view is that the system held up reasonably well. There's been quite a bit of murky protectionism, but overall the system did not show the sort of spiraling out of control tit-for-tat import restrictions like we have seen in, say, in the 1930s. So how will the system hold up today? That's really the big, big question. On the trade facilitation side, very quickly, governments have mostly taken measures to facilitate importation and trade, which of course is great from a WTO legal perspective. Governments have, for instance, waived or reduced import tariffs. They have cut customs processing fees, other monetary charges at the border. They have suspended anti-dumping duties, mostly again on medical products and food products to ensure that there is enough domestic supply. Governments have canceled or put a moratorium on customs duties debts that companies have. They facilitated border procedures, processing procedures, facilitated the submission of documents. A lot of documents could be and can be now filed electronically. And that would be, of course, a great legacy of the crisis, if you wish, if governments could sort of stick to that greater acceptability of electronic documentation, health certificates, import declarations, etc. Some governments have taken very affirmative, very sophisticated action. Just one example, Australia had introduced a mechanism to help importers to negotiate with airlines freight, help them aggregate cargo, loads, etc. So those are obviously very affirmative trade facilitating measures. Governments have also waived and suspended domestic taxes, VAT, excise taxes, sales taxes, again, often on medical products and food products. Another, and this is my
Okay, yeah,
penultimate.
you need to finish quickly.
Okay,
please.
so my penultimate point is governments have also relaxed technical standards. Very interesting, they have accepted other countries' technical standards in lieu of their own to facilitate, to give market access to otherwise ineligible products, which is something that trade law wants governments to do, even in normal times. That's called equivalence. So governments are supposed to, when they can accept each other's technical regulations as equivalent. So many governments, for instance, accepted masks or medical equipment, even though it didn't fully satisfy domestic technical requirements. And finally, I already mentioned subsidies. Large stimulus packages have been introduced by members that give a lot of subsidies that might down the road have a massive trade impact. And of course, it remains to be seen how governments will react to these measures, what impact these measures will have. Many of these subsidies are a lot stickier and will have a much more long-term impact than any import or export restrictions. And so let's see how members react to those, both at the domestic level by imposing countervailing duties, or perhaps even increased litigation at the WTO. Thank you. I will stop here, and thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Jan. We are organizing this session so that we have a couple of papers and then a discussion, just so we're not constantly batting backwards and forwards. So I'll move straight on to the second paper. Two authors of this paper, Michelle Raton-Sanchez-Badin and Magali Favaretto Prieto Fernandez, both from the Julio Vargas Foundation in Sao Paulo. Michelle is an associate professor at the foundation and coordinator of the Center for Global Law and Development and coordinator of the WTO chair in Brazil. She's the current director of the Brazilian chapter of the International Law Association and a founding member of the Society of International Economic Law. Magali is a PhD candidate and legal researcher in the Center for Global Trade and Investment in the Julio Vargas Foundation. So off you go, 8 minutes if you would please, and then I will turn back to Michelle actually as discussant. So Michelle, or whichever, whoever. You're on mute, Michelle.
Magali will take the floor. Thank you, Ellen.
Okay, hello everyone, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to be in this panel. I'm going to share my screen to show the presentation. Everybody can see? Okay, so here, of course, I will take advantage of this broad overview that made by Jan Bohanis on this range of measures taken by governments around the world from a sharp perspective of international trade law. And I will pick exactly where I finished about the technical regulation, because our paper focuses more specifically exactly on this type of measures, which are the domestic, behind the border technical regulation and standards concerning medical products to fight COVID-19. As it was already mentioned, those regulations and standards aimed at facilitating and expediting imports accounted for the vast majority of the measures notified to the WTO, reaching 2/3 of the measures. And our research was based almost exclusively on WTO data regarding those measures, and our focus was to understand what lied behind part of this data and on the role played by the WTO during the crisis, but also before the crisis, taking Brazil as a case study. So I will present each section of our paper in one slide, each one totaling just 4. Here, in the first section of our paper, we present a snapshot of how international trade came to occupy the center of the crisis. So I'm going fast through this one because we already have a very broad overview. about the fact that everybody has seen the shortage of medical supplies, the concentration of exports on certain countries, and some highly regulated products and divergent regulatory systems requiring different standards, tests of quality, certifications, and so on. But what this crisis has exposed about this, economists have pointed to the fragility of long supply chains, the high dependence on certain countries, moving debates and discourses towards repatriation of production and regionalization of supply chains. What were the domestic responses to this? We can, for the sake of simplicity, resume into two kinds of measures: the export bans and restrictions from one side, and from the other side, the facilitating trade measures. In number 4, we talk about the impacts of these responses. As regards to export bans and restrictions, we could possibly anticipate a reduction of global production, possibly the rising of domestic and global prices. And as regarding facilitating trade measures, of course, a timely distribution of medical products. In the next session of our paper, oh no, sorry. Okay, we inquire what's the role of law on all of this. So at the international level, we highlight specifically the role of the WTO during the crisis in guaranteeing transparency, the disclosure and monitoring of the notifications, and how the WTO has acted as a unique multilateral forum for exchange and information and cooperation in a very critical time. So at the domestic level during the crisis, what was the role of law? What was expected from government to keep trade flowing, to lower tariffs, to remove the anti-dumping duties, and to ease and expedite requirements? However, these roles during the crisis could be seen as a reflex of a previous work taken before the crisis, during regular times. In the case of the WTO, we mentioned especially the work from the TBT and SPS committees. Already mentioned before is a hidden behind the scene world of the WTO. We borrowed this expression from a paper written by Andrew Lang and Joanne Scott in 2009, discovering this more silently work of the WTO. And this work refers to the WTO as a repository of trade policies, as a special locus for experience sharing and learning best practices, for the promotion of national bureaucratic structures, and for technical and soft assistance between members and capacity building to developing countries. As regarding to the national level, the role of law is represented by efforts to strengthen transparency, to effectively notify new regulation and changes to regulation, and most importantly, a role valued during the crisis to exercise a cooperative efforts towards harmonization and regulatory cooperation. Then we came to Brazil as our case study in a puzzling case. As this figure shows, it's, sorry for the image, it's not very clear, but it shows that Brazil was the top notifier with 23 measures, being 20 on technical regulation, on the vast majority from 2 regulatory agencies: Anvisa, which regulates health, comprising pharmaceutical products and medical devices, and Inmetro, which regulates technical requirements for guaranteeing the safety of products to consumers. And contrasting this figure, these measures, with the overall measures taken by the government, the actions taken by Brazilian government, we have that everybody knows the current Brazilian federal government is a nationalist and populist government. It has been broadly recognized for the persistent denial of the crisis and divergence from health international protocols from the WHO. And as is the case in other countries, we also have watched fierce clashes between federal and state governments and policies. So within this overall context, what could explain the massive notifications of trade and trade-related measures to the WTO? What are the drivers behind such responses? And what could be the relevance of the WTO on such results? Then we came to our arguments. They are the following. It is still a suggestion taken at the heat of the moment. We do need more evidence and empirical studies from the ground. But our hypothesis is that we have watched in Brazil a dual system in place, characterized by these 3 points. The first is the measures taken by regulatory agencies more connected with international organizations and international practices evidenced the technical work carried out by those agencies that function as inquiry points to the WTO's TBT and SPS committees. Second, the WTO's previous and hidden work on these committees and respective practices during regular times may have influenced and paved a different track, a different response from other governmental bodies. And third, we could imagine a two-folded system, a political driven one led by high-level authorities based on nationalist ideals and opposition to multilateral organizations. And on the other side, a technical driven one led by bureaucrats and lower-level policymakers, animated by international cooperation practices on the ground. So we brought a figure, a metaphor here about the four-wheel drive car, where we would have here in the this axle, the front axle, moved at the international level by the WTO high-level meetings and negotiations, and at the domestic level represented by high-level authorities, the presidents and foreign policy representatives. So this axle got stuck through denials and opposition to multilateral institutions. Then it came into action, actually into evidence, the rare axle represented at the international level by the WTO committees, and the reflex of a steady work taken before crisis, moved at the national level by the regulatory agencies that became more mature during the last 15 to 20 years in Brazil. So this is our paper. Thank you very much for hearing us.
Thank you very much indeed, Magali. So we have a discussant for most of the papers on this session, and that in fact is Michelle, who is going to offer some comments on Jan's paper. But since she can't really discuss her own paper, I'm going to make a couple of comments on her and Magali's paper. But Michelle, why don't you start? You're on mute.
Thank you, Alan. Yes, I'm double hat in this first round as a co-author of Magali, and I'll address, and as a discussant, I'll address my comments to Jan's paper that extensively map all relevant trade measures taken by the WTO members up to now, from export restrictions to trade liberalization measures. Since we're starting this panel, I'll provoke you with more systemic questions. My first question is, where should trade community push for government's efforts at this point? What should be the priorities? Because following how temporary measures are implemented, that is what the WTO is making the effort, or should it open a new round of negotiation for key agreements and commitments, such as it is the case for subsidies? In which areas should we focus? We will have other rounds touching upon the topics of food and health that are very prominent at this moment. Do you have any suggestion on this? And my second question that I would like to have your thoughts is about your view of the role of the WTO in this new scenario of crisis. Are the trade rules still at the epicenter of the global governance, or do you see any other new arrangement between international organization institutions or any other political arrangements? That would be my first comments to Jan's paper. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Michelle. Let me direct a few comments towards you. And let me say to the audience, please do feel free to submit questions via the chat function. Or I guess if you can unmute yourself to shout out, but don't all shout at once. So probably best if you give me a wave on the chat function. Okay, so let me comment on Michelle and Magali's paper. I thought this was very interesting, and I actually want to talk about it in a slightly broader context, I suppose, than just COVID. The story really is you sign an international agreement, you create some domestic institutions, domestic bureaucracy to make it work, and this sort of legitimizes their role. The fact that they're part of the international organization legitimizes their role, and then they represent some friction, essentially, on how rapidly a political system can undo good policy making. That essentially you create institutions that provide a little bit of bottom, even if the politics change. I think the general lesson from this is if you actually want to achieve policy change, you need to think very hard about embodying it, embedding it in institutions. Now, as good liberals, we all love the idea that President Bolsonaro is being tied down a little bit. There are other people we would wish to tie down. But I think it raises a couple of questions, and these are really the questions I will pose to Michelle and Magali in the, in the broad. The first point is, what point does the influence of the institutions of the bureaucracy become illegitimate in a democratic system? What has to happen in order to say, okay, we get you, we're changing direction? The second thing is that how do you sort of preserve these institutions in the face of a hostile political environment? You can't completely preserve them. You can slow down the rate of change. Now, there's a great irony in having a Brit discuss policy making in Brazil, and if there's an American here in the USA. I come from a country that has prided itself on its pragmatic policy making for 150 years, and yet we've had this huge burst of nationalism and what have you. Essentially what has happened, even though you don't see it on the surface, is the civil service has been cowed, very senior civil servants resigning, it's been hollowed out in terms of expertise. And so the question is, well, what must you do to try and, if you can't prevent it, at least slow down that process? And in a sense, from British experience, let me suggest three things one might think of doing. The first is to make sure, essentially, that when the sun is shining on these institutions, you garner some political support. You allow them, certainly the independence and status, and allow them to be staffed by qualified people with some sort of tenure, but you also have to establish them in public recognition. You actually have to allow them to explain what they're doing. In the British political system, for 35 years, blamed every bad event, including the weather sometimes almost, on the European Union. And we then had a referendum campaign, and for 12 weeks, suddenly the government turned around and said, no, the European Union is a really good thing, we ought to stay inside. And people said, what? I mean, you've been telling us for 35 years that you don't like it. So that's essentially the sort of the message that I would bring from where I'm sitting. So let me ask if the authors, have got any responses. I'll turn to Jan first, and then certainly to everybody else in the audience if there are any questions. So Jan, do you want to respond to Michelle's points?
Absolutely. Thanks, Michelle. Great questions. Very, very big picture questions for a detail-oriented technical trade lawyer, but I'll try to answer. Anyway, I think it's useful to think of new areas in which the WTO negotiations could go. But I think the first bullet point on the agenda for the WTO is now to get through this really hostile environment and sort of just survive the many challenges that the system faces today. But to respond specifically to your question, I do think that the COVID crisis has shown, for instance, that you can have very usefully that members at some level need the WTO as a platform to, for instance, coordinate their action on, if you take these export restrictions on medical products, we need international trade to be able to efficiently run, the sort of global health system, if you wish. And if we have people taking advantage of the policy space that they undeniably have under WTO law and impose export restrictions, that has a knock-on effect on the importing countries who won't trust that, in the next crisis, they'll have access to, urgently needed products. And so if, for instance, members see the need for collective action. So in my paper I didn't get the chance to discuss it here for reasons of time, but 24 agricultural exporting members have made this declaration where they said, look, we're pledged not to introduce export restrictions to keep the supply chains running. And maybe we would need something similar for medical products. I mentioned the paper that Professor Winters authored with Simon Avanet, and they said, look, we need sort of a deal, and I think it's a great suggestion that we would need a bargain, for instance, between the exporting and importing countries. The exporting countries say, look, we won't introduce in the next crisis export restrictions on urgently needed medical supplies. And in return, the importing countries say, okay, we won't put up any import tariffs, which they otherwise would, because they say we need to foster our own industries, so we're going to put up tariffs so we can foster industries, because come the next crisis, we can't trust these other people to continue to supply us. And I think that would be a great opportunity, for members to, in effect, overcome the policy space that, is producing suboptimal results right now. And maybe that is part of the response to your second question about, is the WTO at the epicenter at global trade governance? Well, it's part of the puzzle. It's part of the many pieces, together with regional trade agreements, together with other international organizations, whether WHO or OECD, you name it, FAO. I think the point is the WTO provides a service to members. We can think of it as providing a service. And yes, RTAs can also supply some of the rules that we might need at the WTO. For instance, export restrictions. Some FTAs have a lot more stricter rules on export restrictions than the WTO, but it's just regional, right? And so if we could have members want to act at a global level, then the WTO is probably part of the equation. Same with subsidies. It's hard to limit subsidies just at a regional level. It's politically, perhaps we have a better chance for trade-offs at the global level. I hope this.
Thank you very much, Jan. So Michelle or Magali?
I can take the questions. Thank you very much, Alan, for your insightful comments. In fact, this is ongoing work, and for sure that these are very important topics. The first one is about the illegitimate measures in a democratic system. And there we come to the problems, or at least the challenges that modern democracies are facing today. Because even elected governors are not really supported by the majority of the population. And this is the case of the current president. He has a support of 30% of the population. And even that, the support for health policies have been even higher than the 70% that does not agree and does not support the current president. So here comes a challenge of if the current president really represents the democracy or the majority of the population. But this brings us to a different, more broader political scenario beyond the technical one. And for the case of the civil service, possibly Brazil has had a very peculiar situation in the sense of this nationalistic perspective, because although it has a populist inclination, nationalist inclination, the government really doesn't take very nationalistic measures in the economy. It has been very neoliberal in the adoptions of the current economic policies. And in this sense, what happens is that there is a different way of evaluating how the agencies are performing. And some of them that are not really in the sunshine are the ones that are being able to really develop more their work than the ones that are, for example, the case of the health policies today that have been more attacked also by the government, but because it understands that doesn't follow really the policy, and the democratic movement, especially during the pandemic, cannot really react. So, but I don't think that those are final answers to your very provocative questions, but thank you so much for that.
Thank you very much, Michelle. I don't see any questions on the chat function, and since we are already running slightly behindhand, I think I'm going to move straight on, if I may, to the sort of second pair of papers. The first of these is by Ilaria Esper, the revival of export restrictions on food commodities during the crisis, implications for food security in the WTO. Ilaria is an assistant professor of international economic law in the Institute of Law in the Università della Svizzera Italiana. I'm sorry, I'm English, I'm not good at languages. And she's also a senior fellow at the World Trade Institute in the University of Bern. So, Ilaria, 8 minutes.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me?
We can. Yes, thank you.
So thank you so much, Professor Winters, for your kind introduction, and thanks to the organizer of this very interesting conference. I'm delighted to be part of it. And let me, in the interest of time, rightly switch to the topic of my presentation today. And I'm actually very thankful to Jan for having introduced my topic. So this really goes in my own interest, and I would consider some of the concepts already for granted. So I'm not going to have slides, but I'm going to briefly touch upon just 3 points very quickly. The first is to dissect a little bit the relationship between food security and the COVID pandemic, and to explain a little bit how export restrictions on food commodities actually play out in this extremely critical picture, not only from the sole prospects of trade, but also in terms of their food security implications. And then I'm going to be touching upon what the WTO can do to cope with export restrictions on food commodities versus what it has been doing. And finally, a few considerations on what the WTO should be doing. So very briefly on the relationship between COVID and food security and how export restrictions play out in this. So first of all, I should be mentioning that unlike previous pandemics, the COVID pandemic has not directly impacted on agricultural production, and yet it would be a mistake to think that the two are not related, and we should not underestimate this relationship. The first reason is that we are already living in an extremely critical picture in terms of food security. Latest data from the World Food Programme tell us that there are already more than 800 million people who are chronically hungry. 135 million are actually at the brink of starvation. And of course, within this picture, the COVID pandemic risks, of course, to become a main source of increase of these numbers, which are already very worrisome. Lately, the executive director of the World Food Programme actually told to the UN that an additional 130 million people could actually be brought to the brink of starvation because of the coronavirus. And this doesn't not count the results of the economic effects linked to the health emergencies. So basically, in a nutshell, he said, we risk to be living through the worst global humanitarian catastrophe since the Second World War, and basically to be facing a hunger pandemic. So, of course, it is not without surprise that he called for more international collaboration, especially when it comes to states to refrain from using measures that could disrupt supply chains, that could, of course, hamper food security. And here, of course, export restrictions come into the picture as measures that, as Jan already told, have been proliferating. And what is worrisome, they've not been proliferating just on sectors that are directly related to the COVID pandemic, but also to sectors that have nothing to do with the pandemic per se, mainly the sector of food. And here, I'm just going to spend 30 seconds because you've already gotten the picture. We are talking about mostly formal quantitative restrictions, outright bans, but also tight export quotas linked to export licensing schemes that are not automatic, which are, and this is very important, applied by large exporters, right? So there's the virtuous coalition of the willing that Jan mentioned, which released the statement, but there are also large exporters which have been introducing export restrictions on key staples, right? We are talking about rice, we're talking about maize, we're talking about wheat, countries that account for a large share of international supply: Russia, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, Vietnam. Now, of course, we've all learned the tough lessons from the previous crisis. This has already been mentioned. Because of the boomerang effect and because of the domino effect of export restrictions. But of course, in this context, of course, the whole issue is critically important due to the food security implications of these restrictions, which risks exacerbating food and security situations due to the effect they have on prices and quantities available on the market. Now, what can the WTO do about that? Indeed, we do have rules in the WTO. On the substantive side, we have a general obligation to eliminate any of these export quantitative restrictions, even though there are, of course, exemptions and exceptions which are available, and Jan already mentioned incidentally on the critical shortage of supply exemption, in particular under Article 11(2)(a). But very importantly, and this I want to basically underline, these countries that have been imposing export restrictions seems to be sort of given for granted that this exception would apply. But indeed, this is a critical shortage of supply. And as it happens, we are not facing at the moment a problem of availability of food. Outlooks are good, harvests are good. And so, you know, I really doubt that if these measures would be challenged in the system, they would actually pass the test that has been provided under the exception. So, having said that, and I'm going, of course, very quickly, what I want to underline that is that even more so because of the prospects of potential unlawfulness of these restrictions under the substantive rules, the role of transparency provisions is particularly crucial. And here I want to underline something that Professor van der Bosch already sort of touched upon on a more general level, which is basically that also in this particular field, which is particularly crucial for food security purposes, there has been really a lack of transparency when it comes to the countries that have imposed these restrictions. The WTO itself acknowledged that the Article 12.1 of the Agreement on Agriculture, which poses specific notification and consultation requirements for those export restrictions that are imposed on food commodities, has not been complied with. Only 3 countries have actually notified export restrictions under this provision. And basically the WTO has bluntly admitted we have not been able to monitor what's happening. We are relying on other sources. So basically the very mechanisms that were specifically envisaged for the purposes of ensuring these export restrictions do not undermine food security under the Agreement on Agriculture have basically remained unattended. So of course this is worrisome, and why? Because these weaknesses in the rate of compliance with these notifications has delayed awareness in the scope and coverage of these restrictions and eventually their impacts or potential impacts on food security. Now, I'm aware of time, so I'm just going to use 1 minute to tell then what should we be doing. And here I would very much echo what has been already told by in the keynote speech by Professor van den Bosch and also from some previous speakers, which is basically that WTO plays a critical function, at least with respect to the transparency area. And I think this is also one of the strongest takeaways from the COVID-19 crisis. But of course, with respect to the specific issue of export restrictions of food commodities, this is also particularly critical for the reasons that I mentioned. And here I would just like to point out that when it comes to improving this angle, we have already a number of very interesting proposals that have been tabled so far from a number of institutions, not only the WTO, which really aim at strengthening transparency through making notifications obligations of mandatory with strict and binding timelines prior to the application of the measures, which provide for obligations to enter into consultations in all cases, the obligations to suspend the implementation of the measures during consultations, and also the obligations to accept the binding arbitration of a standing committee of experts if consultations are actually not concluded within a reasonable time. So just to conclude, I think that this is already giving us a strong basis to revive discussions on strengthening transparency, which is sort of been a bit of an Achilles heel for WTO lately, especially in the midst of the pandemic, but which I do believe is the most concretely tangible objective that the WTO can still and hence must fulfill in order to avoid a legitimacy crisis, especially given that we're talking about an extremely sensitive issues that has food security implications for the most vulnerable of its WTO members. Thank you so much for your attention. I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Ilaria. Let me move straight on to the fourth paper, and then I will turn to Michelle again for some comments. So the fourth paper is by Alexandra Harrington. It's Rethinking WTO DSB Jurisdiction in the Light of the Pandemic, Climate and Other Evolving Threats, all in 8 minutes. Alexandra is a research director and lead counsel for Peace, Justice and Accountability with the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, and a Fulbright Canada Special Foundation Fellow at the Bolzilli School of International Affairs in Waterloo, Canada. So, Alexandra.
Thank you very much, and I apologize. I'm not coming from scenic Waterloo or scenic Montreal. I'm actually coming from New York, upstate New York, where my lawn folks have decided to come this morning or this afternoon. So if you do hear a bit of a cutting noise, that's them saying hello and adding in their thoughts on the WTO, apparently. Anyway, perhaps it's the agricultural aspect. Anyway, I obviously have a very ambitious topic for 8 minutes, and I will take for granted a certain level of familiarity with the dispute settlement process. If there are any questions, if there's anything that's unclear to the panelists or audience members, please do add that into the chat. I would like to say a brief thank you to the organizers, to our chair, to my fellow panelists, and to the audience. I know that everyone is kind of overwhelmed by being home and all the offers for different types of webinars, etc. So we're very grateful that you chose to join us. And it is wonderful to follow my colleague, Ilaria Espa, who is a very good friend as well as a very esteemed colleague, who pointed out the connection with transparency. And I think this is something that is an excellent kind of segue into this discussion, because one of the most kind of unusual ways that the WTO can generate transparency, although many people don't necessarily look to it for this, is through the dispute settlement system and the bringing to light of a lot of the information behind trade practices, the examining of claims such as the need for public health protection, environmental protection, etc., which tend to be invoked under Article 20 of either GATT or its equivalent under the different World Trade Organization treaties that form the core of international trade law as we know of it, and indeed has often been replicated in different types of regional trade instruments and bilateral trade instruments. But what we don't necessarily have at this moment in time, and what the pandemic can in many ways be useful, if we can call a pandemic ever useful, but useful for us to use as a model, and certainly in the future, most likely coming out of the measures taken for the pandemic, is as a tool to potentially clarify how we handle current and future problems that fall under the Article 20 exception and that would potentially clog, for lack of a better word, the system of dispute settlement and dispute governance that we have established in the WTO at this point. So we've seen a steady uptick in the number of cases that have been filed at the WTO. Obviously, even if they don't go to a full convening of a panel, there is still an organizational burden. There's an organizational burden in receiving the initial complaint, in trying to facilitate some type of conciliatory discussions, in offering good offices, and then later on in convening the panels and potentially the appellate panels. And conveniently or coincidentally or both, the pandemic comes at a time when there has been a great deal of discussion about how do we reform the dispute settlement body? How do we make it more time efficient? How do we make it more economically efficient, especially as we've had more developing states come into the WTO and wish at least to use the dispute settlement system, but often not be able to afford the level of time and legal sophistication it requires to properly carry through a complaint. At this level, at this point, we do run into the requirements of international law and having, as a standard practice, discussions first, and then the idea of a dispute settlement body moving in second. And we do have to have a committee of experts who get certain types of information. And there is a requirement of a certain period of time and investment. What my paper discusses, and obviously it's available to you and I'm happy to talk more about it, is the idea of taking what we know from COVID. And what we know from COVID, especially Jan, I have to thank you because you saved me moments in this discussion by providing, as I think you did with all of us, by providing that background on the number of trade-related activities that have been reported, the exceptions, the restrictive measures that could potentially cause complaints, especially if they're not removed in what is considered to be a reasonable time. Now, we don't know what that will be because many people thought that by now we would at least be done with the first wave and perhaps moving on to the second wave and later on in time, and we're not even there yet. But the potential for these types of measures to generate complaints and require a lot more attention at the dispute settlement body system is in itself potentially problematic and could cause an uptick that will result in years of cases and years of complaints to go forward. At the same time, this is also predictive. For those of us who work in climate change, which is one of my primary areas, it is highly likely that you will see a greater uptick in current and future claims involving activities relating to the environment. We've seen this already in early cases. We've seen this in the shrimp turtle cases. We've seen it in the tuna and dolphin cases. We've seen it more recently in the rare earths minerals cases, where China had attempted to claim that sustainable development was actually one of the reasons for its restrictions on the ability to export and thus the ability to mine large quantities of rare earth minerals. So we've seen environment creeping in with some acceptance when it's done in a way that the WTO system views as being legitimate and not kind of a very cosmetic cover for something else. And with this idea, we've also seen the idea of public health coming in and public health protections. So in the France asbestos case, in the more recent tobacco cases, we've seen allowances of different types of legitimate public health claims. So there's a space under which complaints can be brought and then relatively quickly handled under Article 20 exceptions. And the crux of my paper is really that what we could do to reform, to save on time, to save on costs, is to create a system of subpanels, almost like what has been suggested for the European Court of Human Rights, where you have some basic level that hears the jurisdiction claims relating to Article 20 first. And then if these are deemed to be fulfilled, if there is a legitimate environmental exception or a legitimate public health exception or morals exception, then the case would not have to go on further to have an entire hearing and an entire adjudicatory process. Instead, it could stop and save some sense of money, sense of time, as well as creating a larger sense of what the parameters of these are, of Article 20 is, and what these exceptions are in an evolving space that has clearly moved on a great deal since 1995. So I see our very subtle chair has come back on, and it's actually brilliant. It really is. I had to chair one of these types of panels several months ago at the beginning of the pandemic, and I wish I had this idea then. It would have been far more graceful. But to sum up, what I would like to kind of draw from this is the idea of the pandemic as an opportunity to rethink the way that we conduct the dispute settlement function of the WTO to make it more realistic and reflective of current and future needs, as well as to try to facilitate dialogue with everyone. So to allow more member states to join and have something that is really open to them and alleviate that issue that's been raised. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexandra. So I'm going to hand over to Michelle now for any comments you have on the last two papers. Michelle.
Good. Thank you, Ilaria and Alexandra, for very provocative questions in your papers. Both works bring us to basic needs, anxieties that are coming into light in this, let's say, second moment of the pandemic crisis. Both authors alert us that food and environmental concerns were already floating in international trade debate, but the pandemic had accelerated the emergency of these topics. I have, two questions raised to me from these contributions. Ilaria, we know that trade talks are moving its concerns to food instead of agriculture. Mm-hmm. We see this path in the China-US agreement, for example. And taking this into account, do you think that the policy recommendations and commitments taken by main exporters of agricultural products should follow the same track as that for health and medical products, as both are part of basic products? What would be the difference in case so? To Alexandra, my question is that your paper brings us to the test of WTO capacity to deal with cutting-edge topics. You revise the cases of environmental issues at the dispute settlement body. And what's your suggestion in the current reform of the dispute settlement system? Should members, since having an Article 20 case or a linkage topic, let's say a trade and topic, already opt for an appellate arbitration system? Any other thoughts for the near future that you suggest us?
Of course.
Okay, thanks very much, Michelle. So Ilaria.
All right, thank you so much, Michelle, for your questions. And if I did understand correctly, your question are basically saying whether it would make sense to have a food-specific angle dealt with through WTO rules, rather than just having sort of this Pandora box of agricultural products related provisions. And I look at Alexandra because we are together in this International Law Association committee, which tries to handle, the breadth of international law related provisions concerning natural resources governance. And we've come across the difficulties in disciplining agricultural related problems, which deals with land resources, soil, and really it is a Pandora box. So probably my short answer in the interest of time would be that certainly there is an increasing appetite for dealing with food more specifically, and this has to do also, of course, with all the both legal and also jurisprudential developments around the world with regards to implementing the right to food also. And we do have, to a certain extent already, a sort of a timid effort at the level of already existing WTO disciplines to govern food-related trade impacting measures. And certainly Article 11(2)A is one case in point because it specifically mentions food. But of course, there have been lots of difficulties in evolving at the level of new rules at the WTO more generally, but also with respect to food more specifically, also because, of course, of the critical interest entail. I'm thinking, for instance, also of the stalemate that we've come across for several years, for instance, with respect to the issue of public food holding for food security purposes, which has, of course, a case in point. But certainly, of course, if we want to be, pragmatic, I would say that perhaps we could start having sort of a more food-specific angle to start with. But of course, it would be great if we were to try and improve, agriculture-related provisions more at large. But I don't see that coming anywhere near in the future.
Okay, thank you very much, Alexandra.
Yes, so I think that at least in the short term, the idea of reforming to focus more on arbitration for the dispute settlement system is probably highly appropriate and will most likely be very necessary, especially as we see the financial strains that most governments are now under. So they won't be able to undertake the very long processes that we currently have in place. Whether that is appropriate for the long term is something that is very much, to me at least, up for debate, in the sense that there's a concern that once you start down a purely arbitral focused system, you start to get things like you saw with Argentina coming out of the debt crisis, and then the really incoherent application of panel decisions, and one investor having a very poor day and one investor having a very good day, depending on who was on that particular arbitral panel. So that is my concern for the long term. I think in the short term, we will need to do that just to accommodate the volume and the costs.
Okay, thank you very much. Very interesting. Okay, so the third session that we've got has got two ladies from China, for whom I suppose special thanks are warranted. It's after midnight, so thank you very much for sitting up for us. We appreciate it very much. So the first of the papers is by Ru Ding, Time to Reform the Non-Actionable Subsidy Rules in the WTO and COVID subsidies and beyond. And Ru is Associate Professor in the School of International Law in China's University of Political Science and Law. So off you go, Ru. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Winters, for your very kind introduction. And now I will share my screen with all of you. And hello to my dear colleagues and all the participants. Okay, I just want to confirm if you can see my slides.
Yes, yes we can, yes, thanks.
Perfect. Okay, so the title of my paper is Time to Reform the Non-Actionable Subsidy in the WTO. the COVID-19 subsidies and beyond. My paper is focused on the subsidies related to COVID-19 that adopted or implemented by the WTO members. Actually, Jan has already mentioned this in his presentation, and thank you for that. My presentation consists of 4 parts: the background of this topic, and second is an empirically based research on the COVID-19 subsidies implemented by the European Union, the United States, and China. And the third part is a normative analysis of why I'm proposing to justify some of the COVID-19 subsidies and the certain boundaries that we should have to kind of balance the justification's implication. And finally, I'll conclude with my concrete proposal of what we should do in the future. Let's start with the background. Professor Van den Bosch has already mentioned these members, so I will not repeat them, but we should not forget that behind these members are people who lost their lives, who lost their family members, and who lost their jobs, and who will lose their jobs. So for governments, they need to safeguard the lives of their citizens, to safeguard their job opportunities. They have responded with many monetary, fiscal, or exchange of rate policies to counter the economic impacts of these social and economic consequences. So if you take a look at the IMF policy responses tracker, you can find that among 196 economies over the globe, 194 of them have implemented such economic policies. So I looked through all these countries and their measures, and I focused on the fiscal policies. And among these policies, you can find the following types of subsidy-like policies. So there are subsidies to health facilities, to hospitals, to increase the testing facilities, and subsidies to research of medicines or the vaccines for COVID-19. And we see a lot of grants and loans guarantees, and tax relief for companies for them to endure during the COVID-19, and also to revive after COVID-19, especially to the micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises. And we also see subsidies to individuals. Some are to unemployed persons, and some are just broadly all the residents or taxpayers. And we see a lot of economic recovery package that is in large amount, as mentioned by many of my colleagues already. So the question is that these measures are perfectly justified or legitimate in a domestic context from an economic or social perspective. However, are these measures legitimate under the WTO rules regarding subsidies and countervailing measures? I have a 2-tiered research question here. The first one is more of a positive or analytical, empirical question. That is whether these existing COVID-19 subsidy measures are actionable or prohibited subsidies under the WTO agreement on subsidies and countervailing measures, which we usually call SCM agreement. The second question following that one is that if we don't have such policy space for these subsidies, should we reform the rules in order to incorporate such policy space? So it is basically a normative analysis of whether we should have new rules. And let's move to the second part, a comparative study. So a little bit background on the SCM agreement. So you have a definition of the subsidy under the agreement, and 3 types of different subsidies prohibited, which are export subsidies and subsidies that contingent on purchasing using domestic products. And the large chunk of the subsidies are actionable subsidies, which are provided by government or public bodies to certain recipient, to specific recipient in the form of financial contribution. They can be in loans, grants, direct transfer of funds, provision of goods, all things you can think of. And there's another category of non-actionable subsidies that include research and development subsidies, green subsidies to help environment, and regional subsidies. However, this category is expired 5 years after the establishment of the WTO. I heard the baby talking. And based on my preliminary empirical research of 3 case studies, that is 3 largest trading members in the WTO, the EU, the US, and China, I found many of the measures are actually actionable and even prohibited subsidies. So give you some examples, like the potential prohibited subsidies under the EU's temporary framework for the state aid during COVID-19. You can find in section 3.5, the export credit insurance program. That is, although it's limited in time, but still it may fall into the prohibited subsidy category. And the US CARES Act, which has not yet passed, but if it's passed, it's going to implement subsidies to help domestic medical product supply chain security by encouraging domestic manufacturing. So it can have domestic content contingent subsidies under such policy, and it's prohibited under the rules, means it's per se illegal. And we have a lot of actionable subsidies. The EU one, the one that is going to be passed or not today, that is next generation EU package, it's a really large one. It provides loans and grants to help business, not only to recovery, but to rise stronger. So that's not my words, that's the words of the chairman of the EC. And the US one also provides a lot of loans and grants, and China is very interesting. It's different from EU and US. It's not, there's no formal legislation, everything's at administrative level. So it's all policies, guidance, it's typical China. We do it in that kind of way. And you see there are tax reductions through these policies. And one interesting part is that the government directed those state-owned enterprises who sell electricities to reduce their electricity prices or reduce the rent to help the micro, small, and medium enterprises. So that's a distinctive aspect of China's measures. And there are potential non-actionable subsidies. Some subsidies are non-actionable because you're not specific, and some are potential research and development subsidies. Okay, so I see Professor Winters. I guess my time is quite limited. So I'll just go directly to the proposals. So there are justifications for these subsidies: right to life rationale, a basic human right, and there are economic efficiency rationales that we'd love to hear Professor Winters comment on that, but there should be boundaries to these rules with time limit, with transparency requirement. And thus I propose that we should have a new category of non-actionable subsidy for health crisis under the rules, and can be achieved through either negotiation or a joint declaration, which is, I think, a more manageable approach considering current situation. And I'll finish my presentation with that proposal, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much indeed, Ru. Give us the screen back, won't you?
Okay.
So the final paper is by Liao Che. It's China's response to market-oriented conditions proposal for WTO reform and its implications for a post-Brexit era. Liao is assistant professor and graduate supervisor of the Chinese University of Political Sciences and Law, and a global scholar in the Institute for Social Science Research in the University of Dundee in Scotland. Liao.
I'm trying to ensure that my screen can be shared. Thank you very much, Professor, for your kind introduction. It's my great honor to be here, to be in this panel. It's my great honor from Beijing. And my colleague, Professor Ding Wu, has already mentioned something about like non-actionable subsidies. Well, actually, my studies has been inspired by Professor Ding a lot, so grateful to this, and I send my greatest thanks to the organizers. Compared to Professor Ding's paper, mine is about a more abstract issues, the so-called market-oriented conditions proposals. So how does China respond to it? And does it have any implications? Well, that is the basic structures of my point today. Well, those are some documents I mentioned in my paper. To understand what the proposal about market-oriented conditions is, we'd better to track the history and explore that these proposals was ever formulated. The US has played a leading role in this. Together with the EU and Japan, they drafted 7 joint statements, and all of them include a statement that WTO reform should deal with the non-market-oriented practice of some members. Of course, it's China. Well, recently in this year, 2020, the US submitted a separate WTO proposal regarding this. It is entitled Importance of the Conditions to the World Trading System, the last one. Okay, so the proposal actually includes 2 parts. One is about the setting of the market-oriented conditions as a principle that will guide the forthcoming WTO reform. And the second component is about some elements, some criteria that could establish the non-market economy system or market-oriented conditions. Well, there are 7 criteria, and in the US proposal in 2020, there's additional ones, so 8 criteria. So we can assume that non-market orientation may imply at least 3 things. So for the first year, it's a set of political economic institutions like this. It is purely economic. But secondly, it is something about domestic law. So some domestic legal system will permit some special arrangements for some special countries. They are non-market countries. And finally, there's something about international law. So there are some exceptional cases. Well, ultimately, the rules are for ordinary members, but sometimes there are non-market members, so let's do them in a specific case. Okay, so those are what China proposed. From the first glance, we can now see any matching answers directly linked with China's response to the market-oriented condition proposal. But is the question really like this? Well, some argue that China is trying to avoid mentioning the market issues because it only has some defensive interest, so just do it passively. But this is my paper's question. Well, what does the WTO, why? What underpins the WTO's proposals? Well, concerning the market economy issues. And has China really avoided to mention it? Or alternatively, has China responded to the proposal? If so, how? Well, and we are now undergoing a very hard time. Well, in the time of COVID-19, actually every country is doing something that is not so market-oriented. So does this circumstances change everything? Or just some little things? That is my research questions. Okay. So first, before looking at China's response, I try to explore the concerns behind the proposals. There are 3 here. First one is about some instrumental supply. Well, the US tried to complain that the WTO system currently lacks of something, lacks of the branch of some useful instruments that could deal with the non-market economies. First, the US tried to categorize the Chinese state-owned enterprises as public bodies so they can be the eligible supplier of subsidies. And they use some out-of-country benchmarks in perceiving any countervailing duties investigations. There's something about institutional background as well. It is suggested that some state-directed economies have some institutional advantages, and they should be taken into account by the WTO. And finally, there's something about ideology, well, value judgment. The advantages resulted from particular instruments, well arranged, some institutional arrangements should be deemed as unfair, and a system without governmental direction should be pursued by the WTO. So here is a framework for me to observe China's response. Yes, there are 3 levels: instrumental, institutional, and ideological. And for each level, I answer those 3 questions. The first is about substantive issues. So it's about limits of the market mechanism. And then from a multilateral perspective, what the WTO is supposed to do? It's supposed to balance those kind of issues. And finally, it's about some unilateral perspective. So what a single member could do. Okay, so blend those 3 plus those 3. As just my colleague, Professor Dean said, China proposed to revive the green light subsidies. Well, traditionally, this is sometimes read together with the EU and US proposal, which is try to expand the red light and dark amber light categories. And China's proposal is like this, to recover the green light categories. But the things is not so simple, because China did this to know that these should be instrumental supply to support the government to inject some motivations to the market. So this is the substantive argument concerning a market-state relationship, rather than purely a bargaining strategy. And then, well, concerning what the role the WTO should play, China is suggesting the WTO to maintain a universal and unconditional treatment of non-discrimination. So market-oriented conditions might be said to be the preconditions for a country to acquire non-discriminatory treatment. That is what China would like to object. Well, besides, there are some criteria that is specifically designed for China. Well, for example, the EU once have the criterion about, well, privatization issues. That is not designed for China, but later on such a criterion was dropped out. Instead, something that is especially, that is quite, well, China specific has been introduced. Well, then it's about how to apply this on an instrumental level. Well, here I would like to say that China wants that if give single mass members a lot of discretion, then they will abuse this capacity. So here shows some ambiguity of the wording of the expression of some criterion regarding private law. Well, the requirements of a market economy, so the economy should have a private law system, and to apply the private law, well, equally to each market entities. But those criteria become increasingly unclear, because there's a lot of phrase that leaves flexibility for people, for authority to exercise the discretion. Okay, I will do this very briefly. There's something regarding some institutional setting as well. I will show that there are actually 2 types of criteria to evaluate the degree of market orientation. First is about to directly observe if the market signals are important. And secondly, it's about whether the state plays an important role. So the second one might be problematic, because the state may directly participate in the market. So they are a commercialized, they are a corporatized entity. So how about the circumstances? Well, the problem is about the presumption, because there was a consensus that governmental prices could either be market-oriented or market-distorted. The US tried to say that there should be a presumption that governmental prices are non-market. But in some dispute settlement of the WTO, the parent body repeatedly said that it is the obligation of the investigating authority to demonstrate that governmental prices are non-market. And obviously, China was on the side of the parent body. China said that creating a presumption that an entity run by the state does not inherently act inconsistently with the market economy. Okay, finally, the last level is about ideology. Actually, it's about the value orientation that possessed by the whole WTO system. Well, that was an expected trend described by the US. So an economy could adhere either the state or the market. So there are 2 types of economies, the command one and a market economy one. But China would not do this. well, in a so simplistic way. Actually, it introduced two dimensions. One is the importance of the market. Well, on the other side, it's about the nature of its participants. Well, China argued that although the state may rely on the market, it could be the state. So market economy and the state's presence is not contradictory, inherently at least. Oh, well, to conclude, we can find such a table. It is included in my paper, so I will not repeatedly to read it. On this side, we can find 3 levels, and on this side, we can find 3 topics. Well, we can find that China has not rejected the idea of market orientation, but show its effort to address the limitations of the market. And China strives to deliberate the role of the WTO system. And it tried to focus on some gaps, some potential risks when applying the principles to some basic rules and norms. So the key conception is that a multilateralism with a greater inclusiveness in order to tolerate different types of institutions. And currently, COVID-19 measures, which are usually non-market oriented, are undertaken usually under the name of national security. Actually, that means the capacity to define the market power will be attributed to single members, and that raises the problem because this will augment the risk of undermining multilateralism. So the capacity to judge everything will be just owned by each member. So China's approach may be implicated, for it has tried to raise everything in the whole system, in the multilateral trading system. Okay, so thank you very much for your listening, and thank you very much. I will appreciate any comments and questions. Thank you.
So thank you very much. Thank you very much. That was very interesting. I'm going to pass over to Michelle for comments on these 2 papers, and then I will try and have a very brief period for a general discussion afterwards. Michelle.
I'm on. So first of all, let me thank for the 2 papers. They were the most valuable ones that we had for this panel, and I've learned a lot from both of them. And both papers deal with highly disputed topics at the WTO in this moment. There is the non-actional subsidies and market orientation concerns. And reading this paper, I understood that there is a concern about regulating health emergency policies in the non-actionable subsidies framework. I have 2 questions about this point, and one of them was already mentioned in the chat by Maria Cecilia. The first one is why Article 20 would not respond to the exception of public health emergency actions. Why an exception wouldn't be enough? And this is, I would combine this with the question from Anna Cecilia, I'm sorry for that. Which would be the advantage of reforming WTO rules instead of establishing an exception? My second comment is about, in page 23 of your paper, you have proposed to regulate the use of non-actionable subsidies in reasonable period and with proportion. My question to you is that if you have in mind any sort of analysis similar to that of Article 20 of the GATT, including other alternative, less restrictive measures, what would be the way of interpreting with proportion for you? Yangche's paper go further on the discussion of subsidies and market-oriented notion principle. My question is how the burden of proof should work in these cases for you. Would we have any change in prima facie cases on health and green subsidies? Have you elaborated a little further on that? My last point, and commenting these 2 so insightful papers, is about the legal research method discussion there. It caught my attention the way that both papers apply the model empirical. I would be glad to hear more from Rutin if empirical in your paper concerns the use of economic data, or if there is any test of cause and consequences or variables that you consider in your empirical analysis. And in Nuance's papers, I see a connection of empirical, the notion of empirical, with experience. That is the word that I've got from the paper. And what we often name as the pragmatic approach of China. Could you just explain a little bit more on this point that you've addressed it in the last part of your paper, please? That's are my questions. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michelle. There's an hour's of the discussion there. We don't have an hour, but let me turn briefly to Ruding first.
Thank you, Michelle, for the very good question, and also Anna in the chat panel. As to the question about Article 20, is it like sufficient? There is always a dispute of whether Article 20 can apply to a SIM agreement, and the current WTO jurisprudence is it's not clear, and it tilt toward the non-application of Article 20. The fear is that Article 20 is a too broad carve out so that it can open the Pandora box for the countries to use whatever subsidies they think it can be justified on the Article 20. As we know, Article 20 are phrased as general exceptions. They're not specified. So if we implement that into the SCM agreement, then that would be a too big policy space. So what I suggest is a more detailed set of rules, basically a justification, a category of non-actionable subsidies. It is an exception in essential, but it's more specified to make it limited in nature. And for the proportional test, it's a very good question. I think Article 20 less restrictive analysis can hardly apply here because it's not a restrictive measures, it's subsidizing measures. So maybe you can compare with other markets to see like if other market can do similar jobs with like less subsidies. I'm not sure if that's, I haven't come up with a very concrete test on that, but I'll try.
Market distortion, right? We could get from the market distortion concept here.
Market distortion.
Yeah.
Yeah, that comes to my colleague, Dr. Cholu Yao's paper.
So, Liang.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Winter. Thank you, Michelle, for your, well, very insightful and inspiring comments. Actually, I haven't thought of those two questions very strongly, so I just would like to mention some of my points. Well, regarding how to place a bounded proof, actually before answering this question, I'd like to clarify two things. One is the US proposal, together with EU and Japan, actually directly skip the proof of bounded part. It says that let's just have a unrebuttable presumption. Let's just set out some members to be more market-oriented, and for them, it is always their responsibility to prove that we are not market economy, we are a market economy, or we are market oriented conditions. Sorry, it's not unrebuttable. They are rebuttable. I apologize for this. So that is about the negotiating part. With this part, both parties that participated in such a negotiating process should provide some kind of empirical evidence, so saying that we are trying to set out such a presumption. So that are the materials for us to support our negotiation argument, to support our claims. This is one point. And another point is, I think the existing rules maybe is on the opposition, maybe it's going so far. Well, in the dispute settlement number 397 about the EU fasteners complaint by China, well, the appellant body said that in the existing system, expect, well, Section 15 of the China's Accession Protocol, there's no single rules that support any discriminatory measures against China. So that means that although you raise a lot of empirical evidence that we are a market economy countries, well, that is pointless because the rules does not support any exceptional cases. Sorry for saying this so much, but for currently, I think the best way for us to reform the WTO is try to both make some evidence and then set some presumption. We can allow certain types of exceptions, and I think that might be the like China, like Chinese exporters' obligation to raise that we are a market economy. So, but that really depends on the exceptional rules, just limited within very specific areas, not as a universal rules. That is my answer to this question. And about the empirical study, well, Professor Ding and me, we are in the same group in some like trade remedy issues and also China's subsidy programs. We're trying to find out to what extent, well, China is usually is doing something that is quite non-market, and we're doing something that comparative study could render us some questions, because there are different types of markets in intervention, but not every kind of intervention method are regulated under the WTO system. So that requires a categorization, that requires establishment of framework to comprehensively consider different types of state intervention. That is my answer. Sorry for just my first time to think about this. Thank you very much for your question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Liao. Now, we are basically out of time, so I'm going to proceed as follows. I've got a couple of questions that I have been sent on the chat function. I'm going to present them to you, and then I'm going to go around the panel and ask you to make your final remarks, if you can, with some reference to those questions, but sort of in each case, I'm afraid, with, say, 1 minute, just so that we don't completely crowd out the last session. And I will then actually come back to Michelle at the very end to see if she wants to wrap it up, since she's actually studied all of the papers in great detail. So the two questions that I have from the chat, one is, I think, basically directed to Ilaria, which is that food security is surely a key argument so far that's taking countries away from liberalization. And the question is also, why trade? If it threatens food security, why would you trade? And if you could got a quick answer to that, that would be very nice. The other one is from Abhishek, which is basically saying, I mean, do we think the system is going to move towards one globally of much greater state intervention? And so that, in a sense, the norm that Liao has been talking about of a market-oriented economy is sufficiently dated. And if we are moving in that direction, what does that mean for the WTO? And I say all of that in 1 minute each, please. You can correspond with each other in more detail if you need to. So Jan, let me start with you.
Excellent questions. I think that the question to Ilaria, if I may just briefly comment on that, I think the idea that trade is a threat to, say, food security or medical, or to the security and supply with medical products, I think trade is part of the answer. I don't think it's a threat. It would be extremely costly for all of us to sort of go back to a world where everybody produces everything. It's not even possible that everybody produces everything for themselves, but I think it's important to see trade as part of the solution and even as a risk managing exercise. Again, that was part of I think that's part of that economists like yourself, Alan, I think need to remind everybody of that trade is a risk mitigation device. If we have supply shocks from one part of the world, we can draw on supply in other parts of the world, and trade is a tool for that. And on the last question, on the second question, whether state intervention is, what's going to be happening in the future, maybe in some members, maybe not in all members, but where certainly the trend is going right now, is sort of a commingling of economic and national security issues. I think that's a distinct trend. And I think that makes things a lot more complicated for bodies like the WTO, because a lot of the, I think, not so much the raison d'etre, but the functioning of the WTO and of the dispute settlement system over the decades has been premised on the idea that we can drive a bright line between national security issues that are left to the members' discretion and economic issues where we can have a strong multilateral system, including with a dispute settlement system. So the commingling of the two, I think, is a problem going forward.
Okay, thank you very much. Magali, do you want to add something? You're on mute.
Hi. No, I don't want to add anything.
Okay, fine. Then I'll miss out Michelle for now and come back to you at the end, Michelle. Ilaria.
Yes, thank you so much for the question. And really, to be very brief, I would really echo what Jan was already mentioning. I really do want to see trade as part of the solution. And I think also my presentation was trying to go in that direction, meaning that we do have meaningful substantive rules to regulate those trade restrictions that do actually hamper food security. And I would probably stress that, of course, governments tend to always somehow try and justify some trade restrictions based on short-term effects, but mainly on, or at least mostly based on theoretical economic models, but then reality is another thing, and then also medium to long-term effects are also totally different story. Yes, so I would really urge to seek ways to make the WTO and the multilateral trading system and trade rules as part of the solution to cope with food security and to enhance food security.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. Alexandra.
Yes, I would actually, again, go off Ilaria and just say that as this is true in food security and agriculture, it's also true in environment, that there are many ways we can use a dispute settlement function to regulate and to help ensure that we are actually not using the environment as kind of the boogeyman in the room to really have ideas of negative trade or overstate involvement in trade. And one other point, just to follow up on Jan's point, we need to be very careful when we're talking about the coming together and commingling of national security and trades and exception, that we don't kind of conflate the two, because it's very easy for us to see everything as national security, especially in a pandemic. And we really do need an outside body that can step in and say, you know, no, this is really pushing it too far. This is not a sufficient justification.
Thank you. Ruth.
Thank you, Professor Winters. I will respond on the latter question about state intervention. I don't know the trend, I cannot forecast, but I can share with you some of new trends in China. I'm involved in discussions with academia people and also policymakers in China. So the new trend in China is actually kind of less state intervention. People are seriously discussing about competitive neutrality of state-owned enterprises and transparency of the subsidy reform of the whole system to make it more scientific, efficient, and transparent. So the trend is that we realize we cannot waste too much money on that. The GDP is slowing down and we don't have that budget to hold all those subsidies. So if answering that question from a Chinese perspective, I would say maybe not everyone's going forward for the more state intervention, and maybe a setback on that.
Okay, thank you. Lu Yang. You're on mute.
I'm sorry for that. Thank you very much, Professor. I'd like to try to pick up this question with two different questions by one is Wang Xian and another one is called Mr. N or Mrs. N. I'm sorry for that. Well, I would like to say something about the relationship between market economy and the inclusiveness of the WTO. Well, such a system may tolerate different types of institutions. Does not necessarily mean that such a system tolerate each detrimental effects resulted from those kind of institutions. So the thing really should be cared about of the WTO system is not the domestic institutional setting, but about the real effect resulted from the setting. So the further reform may focus on how to assess the effect of each kind of behaviors of some state-owned enterprises or some kind of industrial policies, rather than saying that setting such a system per se is something untolerated by the system. That is basically my point of view, but it should be supplied with more research. And I'm doing this together with Professor Ding as well. Well, I would like to reflect this more carefully and may show it in my later paper or research. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We always like concluding with the need for more research. Michelle.
I'll be very briefly for the sake of time. I see that the other panelists are joining. I really thank all panelists for the very insightful papers. And for those that had not the chance to read yet, I really recommend that, because we see in these papers trends, means measures and that have been taken by countries, and others that could be said by emerging topics based on the COVID moment, that would possibly reframe trade regulation in the near future. For the regulation on food and all the dispute settlement system, how would that react for the measures that have been taken, and also for new topics that have been raised about the limits of the current regulation that we have in the WTO. So thank you very much. I hope you keep following the next panels that probably will even give more insightful thoughts for us.
So thank you very much, Michelle. Let me wrap up. It's been a delightful session. It's a delight that nearly all the speakers are half my age, and that's extremely encouraging. A long time ago when I started, there were no trade lawyers at all and barely any economists interested in trade policy. We've come an immense way. I think one thing that I've heard in more or less every presentation today is the need for transparency, and that one might need to institutionalize that. One needs to somehow insist that transparency, sunlight is the best disinfectant. Actually, if we know what's going on and we're willing to admit what's going on, we're halfway towards solving some of the disagreements. So a really international panel, really interesting papers. That I do commend them all to the audience, and thank you very much. I apologize, I haven't managed to finish it quite on time, but it was certainly worth stretching a little bit. So thank you all from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alan. I was going to say that it was fantastic time management, I should say. Actually, the best I have ever seen. So thank you very much for that. And it doesn't influence negatively substance. On the contrary, everything was very, very substantively in order, and we enjoyed the panel very much. And thank you to the all panelists for this very fruitful and very interesting discussion. And let me move to our final panel devoted to challenges. Being final panel is always a challenge, so it's logical that this panel is substantively devoted to challenges as well, to challenges for multilateral trading system. And let me introduce the